today, and I wanted to get us out of here as quickly as possible, but I really felt like there was two big questions that I was wrestling with in my heart, and through conversations with other people, these things kept coming back up. And these two questions are, what is the will of God? And what is faith? The will of God is one of those things where life is full of choices all the time, whether we realize we're making them or not. We're making choices all the time, and it's hard to determine, man, what is God's will for my life? What is God's will? You know, I talk to a lot of the youth kids. A lot of them are going off to college, or who do I get married? What school do I go to? What job do I take? I want to please God. I want to do what's in God's will for me, but how do I even know what that is? And then as you get older, a lot of times it's really easy to look at your life and go, man, did I miss God's will? Man, it didn't work out the way I thought it was going to work out for me. Man, well, how do I get back into God's will? What if I feel like I left God's will when my marriage fell apart? Or I left God's will, I missed it somehow when a spouse died or something like that. And you're like, man, my life just doesn't reflect what I thought it would look like when I started following God. And the second question being, what is faith? Because say you do know the will of God for your life. You have a concrete thing. This is what God has for me. This is what He's promised me. This is who I'm going to be. And then it doesn't work out like that. We think of faith as this thing that you work yourself up into, this mental state where you try really hard to believe in something that has absolutely no evidence. You know, people that don't believe look at Christians and look at religious people in general and go, what are you doing, man? You're just believing in some fairy in the sky, some sky genie that doesn't exist. There's no proof. You might as well be believing in the Loch Ness Monster or something. A lot of Christians, when you really press them, what faith is, they would describe something like that. Just blindly believing in something that they have no evidence for. But the thing is, biblical faith is different than that. Biblical faith actually starts with reason. You start by thinking something through. And it only becomes faith when, because of your reasoning about it, you behave differently, you act differently, you live differently. And so what we're going to look at today is actually one story. I think we can unpack these ideas in one story in the Bible. If not fully unpack, at least give you a way to frame them in your mind. Because this has been tremendous in my life. This teaching that I'm about to do is something that I've been learning since I was a little kid. And it has greatly impacted how I live my life. And so we'll pick up in 1 Samuel chapter 16 and look at the life of David. Just the first chapter of the life of David. Well, the first two chapters, really. And we're going to pick up right before David is introduced. The backstory here is Israel has basically rejected God, said, God, we don't want you to be our king anymore. We don't want you to follow you. We want you to give us a king so we can be just like all the other nations. God, give us a king. And God warns them and says, it's a bad idea. You're supposed to be set apart. You're supposed to be a light into the world, all these things. If you give you a king, he's just going to tax you. He's going to send your kids to war. He's going to take your daughters as wives. He lists all the bad things. But they're like, no, give me a king. So God goes, okay, I'll give you what you want. And oftentimes in the Bible, the greatest judgment God can... I'm going to say that again because it's important. A lot of times in the Bible, God's wrath that we talk about the wrath of God, we talk about the judgment of God. Almost always in the Bible, what that is just turning you over to what you already want. It's giving you what you want. He says, Israel, man, don't do this. And they're like, no, we want to do this. And he goes, okay, I'll give you a king. And so he gives them a king. He gives them King Saul. King Saul is a deeply flawed person. It all falls apart. And God says, okay, this experiment needs to change. So I'm going to pick my own king. I'm going to anoint a king that I pick out, that you don't pick out. And he picks David. And so he sends the prophet Samuel to this guy named Jesse's house where he's supposed to find the next king. And Jesse parades all his sons in front of Samuel. He has 8 sons. And he parades them all in front of Samuel. And Samuel sees the tallest one and goes, this has got to be it. But God says, no, that's not it. And they all go in front of Samuel. And Samuel goes, man, this is weird. God rejected all these people. Do you have any other kids, Jesse? And Jesse goes, oh yeah, I do have another son. He's out in the field with the sheep. And this is what's important. They're still the youngest. He's tending the sheep. So I want you to think about this. This is the biggest moment in this family's life. This is the prophet of God has come to their household and told them he's going to anoint the next king of Israel. God has chosen one of Jesse's sons to be the king. And Jesse didn't even invite David. Didn't even think about one of his kids. Like, think about it. David, what's David doing? He's out among the sheep. He's taking care of his dad's sheep. And his whole family has apparently forgot he even exists. Like, he's doing this dirty, thankless job. And the biggest moment of his life is there. And he didn't even get invited to the party. And that's the person that God chooses. This person that is getting no fanfare. He's nothing. And so Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers. And from that day on, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David. And so think about this. They finally go get David, and they bring him in, and the prophet of the Lord anoints him to be the next king of Israel, to be the most powerful man in the nation, to be the most famous man in the nation, the most influential person in the kingdom. And he does it in front of his brothers. Do you think that's going to cause any jealousy with his 7 older brothers, right? It's going to cause problems. But also, too, if you're David, if that's you and you're slaving away at this grunt job that nobody even thinks about you, nobody cares about you, it seems very meaningless. If you're doing all this and they forgot you even existed, would this act of being anointed the next king mess with your mind a little bit, mess with your heart? How long before you think it would take you before you started ignoring your parents? When your dad's like, hey, go back out there and take care of the sheep, you're like, no, sir, I'm the next king. Like, I'm your king, right? How long before he started lording that over his brothers? How long before it changed his actions? How's David going to handle this? Well, we actually don't find out because the story skips to this weird story about Saul, where all of a sudden God orchestrates this scenario where there's an evil spirit messing with Saul, it's tormenting King Saul. And he's like, man, I can't do anything. I need a solution. And for some reason, the people in Saul's court go, we just need a really good musician. If we just had a really good musician, they could come in and they could play the harp and it would drive the evil spirit away, Saul. We believe that. And Saul goes, okay, let's do that. Let's get this musician. Find someone who plays well and bring him to me. And one of the servants answered, I've seen a son of Jesse of Bethlehem who knows how to play the lyre. He's a brave man and a warrior. He speaks well and is a fine-looking man, and the Lord is with him. So first off, if anybody asks you about me, just use that description to tell. But also, think about this. David isn't even in this scene. And God orchestrates this whole scenario, unbeknownst to David, where Saul needs a musician. And for some reason, somebody in Saul's camp goes, hey, I know of a musician. I heard somebody play. And you know what? He was a really good-looking guy, and I think the Lord was with him. All of this happens without David's knowledge. God orchestrates all of this for David. And look where David is. Saul sent messengers to Jesse and said, send me your son David, who's with the sheep. David, after being anointed king, you're going to be the most powerful, influential person, goes right back to doing his job, his dirty, thankless, nobody cares about it job. And somehow through that, someone hears him play the harp. And then God uses this to orchestrate this whole thing. He's just doing what's in front of him to do. And it works out. David doesn't make any of this happen on his own. But somehow, because that guy hears of David, hears him play, because we need God just like you, they call David, he comes in, he plays for Saul, and it works. The evil spirit leaves, and it's great. But the question comes up, how did David even learn how to play music? And he learned how to play while he was among the sheep. While he was doing his dirty, thankless job, for some reason, David learned how to play music. And I don't think the reason he learned how to play music was so he could sign a record deal. Right? He did it because he thought it was cool and he liked it. It was in his heart. Man, I wish I could play the harp. And so he has all this downtime while he's doing this dirty, thankless, boring job. And so he starts learning how to play. And this thing he learned while doing what was in front of him to do, God uses that to put him in the throne room. And so he gets there. and he's playing for Saul, and it works out great. And it says, he entered Saul's service. Saul liked him very much, and David became one of his armor bearers. Then Saul sent word to Jesse, saying, allow David to remain in my service, for I'm pleased with him. So it looks like it's all happening for David, right? God's used this whole deal. He's orchestrated all this. He's put him in the throne room with Saul. You're starting to think, okay, well, Saul's going to die or something. And then they're going to be like, let's make the harp player king. You know, like you don't know how it's going to work out, but it seems like it is. It seems like God's just bringing him on this straight trajectory. But then the story skips and turns to the story of Goliath. It cuts to the scene where the Philistines go to war with Israel, and the Philistines are their arch nemesis, the big bad guys. And they come out, and both armies line up on these opposite sides of hills. And it turns out the Philistines have a giant. If you were here a couple weeks ago, Trey talked about giant. This is a dude, he's 9 feet tall. He's a son of Anak. He's a man of the name. He is a product of a spiritual rebellion in the heavenlies. This is a bad dude. And so he starts taunting Israel, saying, send somebody out. We'll fight one-on-one. And whoever wins determines this war. It's like that scene in Troy, if you've ever watched it with Brad Pitt, right? They send out their champions. Whoever wins, it's a done deal. One-on-one combat. But the thing is, he's so big and terrifying, and the Israelites know all about the sons of Anak. They know all about the Genesis 5 and 6 scenario. No one wants to fight Goliath. They're terrified to go out. So every day, Goliath comes out and taunts them in the morning. Nobody comes out to fight, and he goes back out in the evening, and he taunts them again. This goes on for 40 days, and nobody will fight him. They're all too scared. And the story turns back to David. It's just jump cutting, back and forth like a movie. So Jesse had 8 sons, and in Saul's time, he was very old. Jesse's 3 oldest sons had followed Saul to the war. The firstborn was Eliab, the second Abinadab, and the third Shammah. David was the youngest. The 3 oldest followed Saul, but David went back and forth from Saul to tend his father's sheep. This huge war is going on to determine the fate of the nation. And David didn't even get to go. David's still home taking care of the sheep. And not only that, his dad, while he's taking care of the sheep, decides to make him an errand boy and say, hey, I got some sandwiches, basically. Take them to your brothers at the front line. Go take them, make sure they're okay. I'm really concerned about the brothers. I want to check on them. So if you're David, think about this. You have this definitive promise from God. This is what your life is going to be like. I'm going to make you king. I'm going to make you ruler. At this point, years have kind of gone by. Do you still trust God to make this happen? Or are you mad that life hasn't worked out this way? You're still doing the dirty, thankless job. No one really appreciates you. Even though they all saw you get anointed king, they're still ordering you around. You're still being a sandwich boy. You don't even get to go to war where you can make a name for yourself, where you could get fame. And you're on the sidelines. You're on the bench, and it feels like that in your heart. But David apparently does not feel that way. He's not wondering where God is. His dad tells him, hey, go take these sandwiches. He goes, yes, sir. And he takes them. Remember, David's like 13 years old, 13 to 15. If any of you have teenagers, like if you're like, hey, go take out the trash, or they like, oh, man, I don't want to do that, David, he's like, hey, take these sandwiches to these brothers that you're supposed to rule over pretty soon. Hey, David, go play harp for this guy that you're supposed to replace. Hey, and David's like, okay, I'll do that. You asked me to do it, I'm going to do it. And he takes it and he doesn't complain. And so he gets to the war, and it says David left his things with the keeper of supplies, ran to the battle lines, and asked his brothers how they were. He ran to the battle lines. That's an interesting detail. Biblical authors don't give you tons of detail. They do a lot with little words. It says, as he was talking with him, Goliath, the Philistine champion from Gath, stepped out from his lines and shouted his usual defiance. And David heard it. Whenever the Israelites saw the man, they all fled from him in great fear. So this has been going on for 40 days. David apparently has been with the sheep for 40 days because this is news to him. He hears this guy and he's like, we're just going to let this happen? You're just going to let this guy talk trash about our nation and our God? And he starts asking the people around him, hey, what happens for the guy that kills that guy? What are we waiting on? Are we waiting on like a reward before we go do this? And he starts just asking questions. And so think about it. Why in the world, up until this point in the story, would David have any faith that he should fight Goliath or do it? Nothing has happened for him. He's still among the sheep. He's still doing the grunt job. But for some reason, David really thinks he can kill Goliath, but not before he has to deal with his oldest brother. His oldest brother, Eliab, heard him speaking with the men, and he burned with anger at him and asked, "Why have you come down here? And with whom did you leave those few sheep in the wilderness? I know how conceited you are, how wicked your heart is. You came down only to watch the battle." Think about this. David, up until this point, has only done what's in front of him to do. He's been faithful in the very little that he's been given. And I don't know where you are at in your life, but if you've ever been in a job that feels very thankless and very meaningless, where you're like, man, I don't see any point in doing what I'm doing. I don't see any point. It feels like I'm not getting ahead. It feels like life is meaningless. It feels like this job's not taking me anywhere. It feels like, now imagine the scenario where a person that you love the most in life, someone that you look up to and comes up to you and just diminishes you for doing what you're doing. And he's hateful about it. Like these few sheep, David. And he starts making, oh, you're wicked. Imagine someone you love the most making fun of you for your job. Make it like, dude, you're worthless, man. You just take care of a few sheep. Wouldn't you want to defend yourself? Be like, no, I mean, I'm doing what God, Dad told me to do. And, you try to defend. David doesn't defend himself at all. He just takes this and he turns around and starts asking other people. No, okay, Eliab. Hey, what happens if I kill that guy? And everybody's like, what are you talking about? And somehow it gets back to King Saul. It gets back to King Saul. And he ends up in front of him. David said to Saul, let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him. Remember, he's supposed to replace him. He says, your servant will go and fight this man. Now again, why would David have any belief, any kind of faith that he can go do this? We don't know yet in the story. First, Saul has to talk down to him. Saul says, you're not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him. You're only a young man. He's been a warrior from his youth. Like, David, man, this is a giant. This is a son of a knock. This is a bad, bad dude. He's been killing men since before you were born. You're 13 years old. Sit this out, right? And then here's where we start finding something out. David said to Saul, your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. He's been doing what was in front of him to do. When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it. I struck it, and I rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God. So right up until this line, it seems like David is just very confident in himself. Like, I can just go kill this guy. It's fine. I killed a lion and a bear. But look at what David attributes those scenarios to. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine. So we find out why David has faith. Because he's already fought battles. And God has already come through for him. And where did he fight these battles? He fought them in the shadows, in the thankless, doing this grunt job that nobody even knew about, where his own family even forgot he was doing the job. He was faithful, and he kept showing up, and he kept showing up. And through him showing up to that, he learned to play the harp. And God used that to put him in Saul's court. And then he goes back, and he keeps taking care of the sheep. And then through that, God sends a bear. And you're like, man, if you're David, you're 13 years old, do you want to fight a bear? No. Are you terrified? Yes, absolutely. But for some reason, David fights this bear and he kills it. And then later, a lion comes. If you're terrified, you don't want to do this, but it's your job. I'm doing my job. I got to protect these sheep. That lion stole a sheep. Guess my job is to kill that lion now. And he does what's in front of him to do. And somehow, for some reason, in those instances, when David looks at those things, He sees the hand of God in his life, that God moved in his life, that God delivered him through it. God didn't prevent those bad things from happening to David. He did not prevent it. A lot of times we think, man, God just prevent all the sorrow, prevent all the, man, just bless me, bless me. He didn't prevent these bad things from happening, but he delivered them through it. He delivered David through this trouble. And when David looks back, he can point at this and say, I know God will deliver me from Goliath because he's already done it twice. I have faith. And that's what faith is. We think faith is just working yourself up into this thing. It's just trusting the character of the one who made the promise. And David can look back and be like, no, I trust God. I trust that what he said about me, he will do. Like if Lindsay asked me to do something, if she promised, I can trust that she'll do, because I know her. I know who she is. If some random Joe Bob comes up and is like, hey, no, okay, I'm skeptical of this. But I know Lindsay. And David, through being among the sheep and just doing what's in front of him to do, has developed a relationship with the Lord. He's going to go on to write 2/3 of the Psalms, the worship songs, the prayers, the things in the Bible. Where did he learn how to do that? Taking care of his father's sheep. Just doing what's right in front of him to do. And of course, he does. He kills Goliath, and he takes Goliath's own sword, cuts Goliath's head off, and he keeps it. He keeps his head. He keeps his sword. And that's one thing that David is very good at in his life, that he keeps trophies from the battles that he's won. Where God has come through for him, he keeps a memento of it. So that later in his life, when things are going bad and his life is falling apart, he needs a sword. And he goes, oh yeah, I have a sword. Goliath's sword. And he goes and gets it out of storage. And he looks back and he looks at the head of Goliath. And all throughout his life, David looks back at these times where God has moved in his life. And he internalizes them. And he uses them to build on for the future. And so, what is faith? It's that. Some of you guys might be going through a time in your life where you don't feel any faith at all. You don't feel anything, that God's going to do anything with you, or that what you're doing right now is meaningless. It just doesn't make any difference, and nobody sees you, and nobody cares about you. And you're like, man, God's given these promises. He's promised me healing. He's promised me these things. I look at the Bible, but I just don't feel it. And what I would encourage you to do is look back at your life, because there's probably been some times where God has moved in your life and you've forgotten about it. Times where you've cried out to God and said, man, God, I need you in this. You've got to deliver me from this. And he does. And then 6 months later, you've forgotten all about it. Or if it's never happened to you, if you've never encountered God and you've never had this moment, man, find somebody who has and build on their faith. Pray with them like Joy was talking about up here. Find someone in this church that's been healed of something. People in this church have been healed of cancer, of all kinds of disease. If you need healing, partner with one of them. Say, man, pray for me. I need help with this. And the other thing about this is, before David goes out there to kill Goliath, Saul tries to put his armor on David. He gives him the king's armor and the king's sword. And David tries it, and he's like, man, I can't do this. This isn't me. These don't fit me. I'm 13 years old. He's like, all I need to fight Goliath is what I already have. What's in my hands right now. And this is a theme all throughout the Bible. Think about like Moses. Be like, how are they going to believe me? How is Pharaoh going to believe me? And God's like, hey, what's in your hand? It's like, oh, a staff. We'll use that. And with David, I'm going to go fight Goliath. What's in your hand? Oh, I got this sling. I don't have any weapons, but I got this sling that I use as a shepherd. God's like, that'll work. And what happens is we always want to cut corners. We always want to be like somebody else. We want to worship like somebody else. We want to have somebody else's blessing. We want to have all these things. God will use what's in your hand right now. And this is where it comes to this will of God. What is the will of God? How do we know what this is? David is marked by this. Most of his life. He goes a little off the rails later in his life. But one thing that marked David is that he is promised to be king. He is anointed to be king, and he never tries to make it happen on its own. He learns the skills. He does what's in front of him to do. He's faithful taking care of the sheep. He's faithful. And God uses all the skills that he's learned, taking care of the sheep, fighting the wolf, fighting bear, to kill Goliath. And you think, okay, he's going to be king now. It's all going to be, nope. It goes 20 years from the time that he kills Goliath to the time that he becomes king. Most of that, David spends running for his life because Saul wants to kill him. And at what point in this scenario would you be like, okay, man, I'm going to make this happen on my own? Because at the end of this tale, at the end of Saul's life, David is a renowned military man. He has killed hundreds of men by himself. He has slayed all kinds of giants. He's a leader of men. He has his own army. Saul's trying to kill him. And God keeps putting Saul right in David's hand. And David's men are like, just kill Saul, man. Kill Saul and take the throne. Everybody wants you to be king. But David never will. He never will. All he says is, no, God will take care of it. When God is ready for me to be king, he'll make it happen on his own. And that's the deal. Like, how do you know what the will of God is? Well, it's whatever you're doing right now. The will of God for you right now is in the marriage you're in right now. It's in the job you're in right now. It's in the school you're at right now. All it is you just be faithful with what's in front of you to do. And while you're doing that, you're going to end up fighting some battles that might seem totally meaningless. Your job might seem totally thankless. But what God is doing in that, when you just approach it with, man, I'm doing this job as unto the Lord. I'm taking care of these sheep as if they're God's sheep, not my dad's. I'm doing my job as if God's my boss, not this boss that I feel like I could be better than. You know what I mean? Like we have this, and David never does it. He never tries to use his talents and abilities that God's given him to open a door for himself. He just waits on God. Even if that means running from his life, instead of fighting a guy that he could beat, he keeps running for his life. Says, God, I trust you to make it happen. I trust you to fulfill your purpose in me. And so what does this look like for you? I don't know. I know for me it's worked out this way. Because I learned this so young, man, I've really tried to model this in my life. And, I think I've told this story several times, but there was a time in my life where I didn't like who I was becoming. I didn't like who I was. I'd been through some hardships, and instead of dealing with them the correct way, I started drinking and things like that. And I got to a point where I don't like who I am. And so I quit my job and said, God, I'm just going to give my life to you, really. I'm going to really try to let you work this out in me. And I went to work as a janitor and worked as a janitor for years. And I had that mindset. And I had to remind myself of this every day. I'm cleaning toilets as unto you, God. Because nobody cares when you're cleaning toilets. Nobody is looking like, man, great job. You're making something of your life. They're like, okay. I did that for years, and I let God work in my heart. And I let God work humility in my heart and try to start doing that. But then after a few years, I thought, man, God, I feel like I'm ready for something else. But instead of quitting my job and going and applying somewhere else or doing something, I said, God, you open a door for me. I'm just going to keep doing that. I'm going to be faithful with what's right in front of me to do. And I'll trust that when you're ready to move me to something else, you will. And sure enough, after doing that for a couple of years, somebody approaches me and says, hey, we want to start a coffee shop. I know you have experience with that. Will you help run this coffee shop? I said, okay. I felt good. I felt a peace in my heart. So, all right. So I went and I ran the coffee shop for several years. And I learned all kinds of things. And I grew. But then eventually you get tired and you feel like, man, I know everything to know at this job at this point. God, I'd like to do something else. And I kept doing it, and I kept doing it, and I kept doing it. And then somebody approaches me in the coffee shop and says, hey, I have a job offer for you. Will you meet with this guy? And I felt good about it. I said, okay, I'll go meet with him. And I did. And I ended up working that job for 8 years until I got to the point where I'm like, man, I hate this job. Can't do this job anymore. I've learned it all. It's super stressful. I've grown so much. I've learned all these things, but God, I'm done. And I started praying that prayer. God, open a door for me. And it was years before God opened a door for me. But he did, and it was this church. Daryl saying, hey, would you be a youth pastor? Never in my mind had I ever even considered preaching or being a youth pastor for anybody. I don't even like kids that much, just honestly. But I've been doing that for a year, 5 years now? Almost 6 years as the youth pastor. But then even this, preaching here, I've never sought this. And here's how it works out. What I want to get through to you is this. When you do follow God and you do trust God like this, it works out way better for you than if you try to make it on your own. And the reason why is God knows me way better than I know myself. He knows my weaknesses way better than I know myself. I know I'm a flawed person, but God really knows how I'm flawed, what will make me stumble, what will mess me up, well, even the good things in life that I think I want. All the time, like we talked about earlier, sometimes the worst thing for you is to God give you what you want. That's associated directly with God's wrath all throughout the Bible. That his wrath being poured out is him just turning you over to your desires. Like, that's what it is. And so when you approach it this way, you never have to worry if you're in the will of God because you're trusting him to move you to where you want to be. And you never have to have this deal. It's like, am I where I'm supposed to be? Am I with who I'm supposed to be with? Am I doing what I'm supposed to be doing? Because you can just have this trust that God will work it out for you. And he knows what will bring you joy way better than you do. I really enjoy doing this and preaching and studying the Bible. I did not think I would. I really didn't. Like I said, I always wanted to be a part of a church, but never envisioned this. But I enjoy it. And I never took one step to try to make this happen. This is a gift from God. Just like David being able to look back and be like, man, God did that. I can look back in my life and say, God did that for me. So I can trust him for the next phase of my life. I can trust him for what's next. All I have to do, all you have to do, is just be faithful with what you're given right now. No matter where it is. If you're in a marriage, man, really focus on being the best husband or the best wife that you can be. Yeah. Focus on it. Make it a priority. If you're a parent, focus on being the best parent you can be. Be faithful with what's in your hand right now. Because you never have any idea what little seamless, meaningless thing God's going to use for your next season to put you in the next place. And if you refuse to learn it because you think this season is dumb or it's meaningless, then there's not a next season for you. You stay in that place until you learn what God's trying to teach you. You stay in that place. You stay in that dry place until you figure out how to lean on him and trust in him. And so, as the ministry team comes up, we're going to close with this. What does all this mean to you? I don't know. You know? I know what it means to me and in my life. I know how it's worked out for me, and I know how it worked out for David. But for you, maybe you feel like, man, I missed God's will a long time ago. And I want to assure you, you did not. God is able to redeem the years. He's able to bring life out of death. He's able to bring beauty out of ashes if you trust him. If you say, Father, here I am. God, I commit to being faithful with where I'm at right now. And I trust that you're going to move in my life. I believe in your character, God, that you are faithful to finish the work that you started in me. And there's going to be hard times, that is for sure. Just because you're submitting yourself to God. David ran for 20 years. You think of all the people in the Bible, the Josephs, the Daniels in exile. God's plan for your life is never pain-free. It just is not. But what he is with you in it and faithful to get you through it and faithful to work his promises out. And so if you need healing today, if you need to have that faith and you don't feel it, I want to encourage you just to ask God, God, reveal yourself to my heart. Just quiet your heart, quiet your mind, say, God, I need you to reveal yourself to me. I need a moment to start building my faith on. God, I need a trophy. God, I need something where I can look back and say, you did this. And if you feel broken, if you feel like you can't do that, then I want to encourage you to come get with some of these people up at the front here. These people that have seen miracles, that have had miracles worked in their own lives and in their own heart, and let them have faith for you. because we have seen miracles in this place and we will see them again. Because we know that we can trust the God who brings life out of death, the God who brings beauty for ashes. We have a reason to believe it because we've seen it. So, Father God, come reveal yourself to your people. Move in our hearts, move in our minds. As we go out from this place, God, man, catch us during the week when we don't expect it. God, deliver us from our times of trouble and let us know that you did it. So that like David, we don't just say, oh, this was a coincidence. Oh, this was just my talent doing. That we look at that and say, the Lord rescued me from that. The Lord did that. God, just come heal our hearts. God, bind up the brokenness in us. God, have your way with our lives because we know we can trust you and we know that it's better than anything we could do for ourselves. It's in your name we pray. Amen. Y'all have a good week.